Buckle up for a tale of heart, grit, and quiet courage that'll hit you right in the feels. Meet a man whose kindness shakes a sleepy town, battling betrayal and doubt, proving some heroes don't need capes, just a stubborn heart. Stay to unravel the mystery of a stranger who changes everything. Like, subscribe, hit that bell. Stories like this spark hope. The small coastal town of Havens End smelled of salt and diesel, its mornings wrapped in a fog that clung to everything like a second skin. A 65-year-old man shuffled along the cracked sidewalk, his silver hair catching the faint dawn light. His navy jacket, faded at the elbows, hung loose over a frame that had once been broad, but now carried the weight of years. His jeans, worn thin at the knees, whispered against each other with every deliberate step. In his right hand, a battered toolbox swung gently, its rusted hinges creaking like an old friend complaining about the early hour. His blue eyes, tired but sharp, scanned the sleepy town. Wooden fences sagging under the weight of time. Fishing boats bobbing in the harbour, their paint chipped by the relentless sea. This was Henry, though no one called him that anymore. To Havens End, he was just the fixer, the man who mended broken things, fences, chairs, lives, without asking for thanks. His routine hadn't changed in decades. Up at 5, coffee black as tar, then out the door to answer the town's quiet calls for help. A wobbly table at the diner, a gate that wouldn't latch, a widow's leaky faucet. He never charged, though his own fridge often sat empty. His hands, calloused and scarred, told stories he never shared, stories of a life that hadn't gone as planned. 30 years ago, he'd been a shipbuilder, proud and strong, with a wife who laughed like summer rain and dreams of a family. But the shipyard closed, his wife faded under cancer's shadow, and the dreams? They'd slipped away like the tide, leaving only a quiet man in a quiet town, fixing what he could. This morning, his boots crunched on gravel as he headed toward the pier. The air was thick with the tang of seaweed and the distant rumble of a trawler starting its engine. His eyes lingered on the horizon, where the first rays of sun pierced the fog. There was a flicker in his gaze, hope, maybe, or just the stubborn refusal to give up. He adjusted his grip on the toolbox, the metal cold against his palm, and kept walking. Havens End was waking up, but it felt like the town held its breath, waiting for something to shift. At the pier's edge, where the wooden planks groaned underfoot, he stopped. A small figure stood there, half hidden in the mist. A girl, no more than 10, with messy brown hair spilling out from under a patched green sweater. Her sneakers were scuffed, one lace untied, dragging in the damp. She clutched a crumpled piece of paper, her hazel eyes wide and wary, like a deer caught in headlights. She didn't belong here. Not this early, not alone. Henry's first thought was to keep walking. Kids weren't his business, and the town had enough busybodies to handle strays. But something in her stance, the way her shoulders hunched against the world, stopped him cold. "Hey there," he said, voice low, like he was coaxing a skittish cat. "You okay?" The girl flinched, her eyes darting to him, then back to the water. "I'm fine," she mumbled, but her voice cracked, too small for the weight it carried. Henry set his toolbox down, the thud soft against the wood. He didn't move closer, didn't crowd her. Instead, he leaned against a post, letting the silence settle. The sea lapped at the pilings below, a steady rhythm that matched his breathing. He noticed the paper in her hands. A drawing, maybe, smudged with pencil and folded too many times. "Lost something?" he asked, nodding toward the paper. She shook her head, quick and sharp, but her fingers tightened around it. "Not lost," she said, "just waiting." Henry raised an eyebrow but didn't press. He'd learned long ago that some stories only came out when you gave them room to breathe. Instead, he reached into his jacket and pulled out a small, dented thermos. "Coffee's not much, but it's warm," he offered, unscrewing the cap. The girl hesitated, then took a step closer, her sneakers scuffing the planks. She didn't take the thermos, but her shoulders eased, just a fraction. He poured a little coffee into the cap, the steam curling in the cold air. "Name's Henry," he said, not looking at her, giving her space. She didn't answer, but she sat down on the pier, legs dangling over the edge. The drawing stayed in her lap, her fingers tracing its edges. Henry sipped his coffee, the bitter heat grounding him. He didn't know this girl, didn't know her story, but he knew the look in her eyes. Loss. The kind that left you untethered. He'd seen it in his own reflection too many times. "Pier's a good place to think," he said after a while. "Quiet, nobody bothers you. She nodded, barely, her eyes fixed on the water. The fog was lifting now, revealing the jagged coastline and the gulls circling overhead. Henry glanced at her drawing, catching a glimpse of pencil lines. A house, maybe, or a tree. He didn't ask. Instead, he pulled a small screwdriver from his toolbox and started tightening a loose bolt on the pier's railing. The rhythmic scrape of metal on metal filled the silence, steady and unintrusive. The girl watched him work, her gaze curious despite herself. "Why do you do that?" she asked suddenly, her voice small but clear. "Do what?" Henry replied, not looking up. "Fix stuff for free." He paused, the screwdriver still in his hand. For a moment, he saw his wife's face, her smile when he'd built her a bookshelf from scrap wood. "Guess it's what I'm good at," he said finally. "Makes things a little better, maybe." She didn't respond, but her eyes lingered on him, like she was weighing his words. The sun climbed higher, burning off the last of the fog. Henry finished with the railing and packed up his tools. "Gotta head to the diner," he said, standing. "You need anything, kid?" She shook her head, but her fingers loosened on the drawing, just a bit. "Be careful out here," he added, his voice gentle but firm. He turned to go, his boots heavy on the planks, but he felt her eyes on his back. Something told him this wasn't the last time they'd meet. As he walked toward town, the air warmed, carrying the scent of fresh bread from the bakery. Havens End was stirring now. Shopkeepers sweeping sidewalks, fishermen hauling nets, kids racing to school. Henry's toolbox swung at his side, a familiar weight. He didn't know it yet, but that girl on the pier had just set something in motion, something that would shake the town to its core. His small act of kindness, that quiet offer of coffee, was the first ripple in a wave he couldn't see coming. By the time he reached the diner, the morning rush was in full swing. The bell above the door jangled as he stepped inside, greeted by the clatter of plates and the hum of conversation. "Morning, Henry," called Sally, the waitress, her apron stained with coffee. He nodded, sliding into a corner booth. The diner was his second home, its vinyl seats cracked but comfortable, its air thick with the smell of bacon and syrup. He set his toolbox under the table, the metal scraping the linoleum. Sally poured him a coffee without asking, her smile warm but tired. "Got a job today?" she asked, wiping her hands on her apron. "Always do," Henry said, his voice a low rumble. He sipped his coffee, his eyes drifting to the window. Outside, the town moved at its usual pace, but something felt different. He couldn't shake the image of the girl on the pier, her small frame against the vast sea. He didn't know her name, didn't know her story, but he knew she needed something. Maybe just someone to see her. Across the diner, a group of fishermen glanced his way, their voices low. "Henry's at it again," one muttered, shaking his head. "Fixing the world, one screw at a time." The others chuckled, but there was no malice in it. Not yet. Henry ignored them, his fingers tracing the edge of his mug. He'd heard the whispers before, the ones that called him a fool for working for free, for caring too much. But he'd learned to let them slide like water off a duck's back. The bell jangled again, and a woman entered, her coat damp from the morning mist. She was new to town, or at least new to Henry's notice, her face lined with worry. She carried a broken lamp, its cord dangling like a lifeline. "Heard you fix things," she said, approaching his booth. "Can you help?" Henry looked at the lamp, then at her. Her eyes were tired, like his, but there was a spark there, a quiet strength. "Sure," he said, sliding the lamp closer. "Let's see what we can do." As he worked, stripping wires with practiced ease, he felt the diner's eyes on him. Some watched with warmth, others with skepticism. "That's Henry," Sally whispered to a new customer. "Never says no to a job." The words were kind, but Henry knew better than to trust them. Kindness in Havens End was a fragile thing, easily broken by envy or fear. He focused on the lamp, the familiar rhythm of his hand steadying him. But in the back of his mind, the girl on the pier lingered, her drawing a question he couldn't yet answer. The diner's hum faded as Henry twisted the last wire into place, the broken lamp now whole again. Its soft glow lit up the woman's face, her tired eyes softening with gratitude. "Thank you," she whispered, pressing a crumpled $5 bill into his hand. Henry shook his head, sliding the bill back across the table. "Keep it," he said, voice low but firm. "Just pass it on someday." She hesitated, then nodded, clutching the lamp like a lifeline as she left. Henry leaned back in the booth, the vinyl creaking under him, and sipped his cooling coffee. The toolbox at his feet was a quiet reminder of the day ahead. More fences to mend, more lives to patch together. But his thoughts kept drifting to the girl on the pier, her crumpled drawing, her wary eyes. Something about her stuck, like a splinter he couldn't ignore. By noon, Henry was back on the pier, the sun high and the fog long gone. The air carried the sharp bite of salt and the distant clang of a buoy. He'd been called to fix a loose plank, a job no one else in Havens End bothered with. His knees ached as he knelt. Toolbox open beside him, the familiar scent of grease and metal grounding him. The pier stretched out like a weathered spine, its boards scarred by years of storms and footsteps. He worked steadily, the screwdriver's rhythmic scrape blending with the lap of waves below. Then he saw her again, the girl from the morning, sitting cross-legged at the pier's edge. Her green sweater was too big, swallowing her small frame, and her sneakers dangled over the water. That crumpled drawing was still in her hands, now folded even tighter, like a secret she was afraid to let go. Henry didn't say anything at first. He tightened another screw, giving her space, letting the silence do the talking. She glanced his way, her hazel eyes catching the sunlight, and for a moment, she looked less like a stranger and more like someone he'd known forever. "You're back," she said finally, her voice barely above the waves. "Work's not done," Henry replied, nodding at the plank. "You?" She shrugged, her fingers tracing the drawing's edges. "Nowhere else to go," she said, and the words landed heavier than they should have. Henry paused, his hand still on the screwdriver. He wanted to ask, "Where's your family? Why are you alone?" But he didn't. Some questions were too sharp for a first cut. Instead, he pulled a small apple from his jacket pocket, one he'd grabbed from the diner. "Hungry?" he asked, holding it out. She stared at the apple, then at him, like she was testing for a trap. After a long moment, she took it, her fingers brushing his calloused palm. "Thanks," she mumbled, biting into it with a crunch that echoed in the quiet. They sat like that for a while, Henry working, the girl eating, the pier holding them both. He noticed her sneakers were more worn than he'd thought, the soles peeling at the edges. Her sweater had a hole near the cuff, threads fraying like they'd given up. He didn't comment, but his mind was already turning, thinking of the spare sneakers in his shed, a pair his wife had bought for a nephew who never came. "You draw that yourself?" he asked, nodding at the paper in her lap. She froze, her hand tightening around it. "Yeah," she said, voice tight. "It's mine." Henry nodded, letting it go. He'd fixed enough things to know when something wasn't ready to be touched. But as he worked, she unfolded the drawing just a bit, revealing a pencil sketch of a house. Simple, with a tree out front and a figure in the doorway. It wasn't a kid's scribble. It was careful, deliberate, like it held a piece of her soul. The afternoon wore on, and the pier grew busier. Fishermen hauled crates, their boots thumping against the planks. A few townsfolk passed by, nodding at Henry or tossing him a, "Hey, fixer!" But their eyes lingered on the girl, curious, suspicious. "Who's that?" A woman in a red scarf muttered to her friend, loud enough for Henry to hear. "Some runaway, probably," the friend replied, shaking her head. Henry kept working, but his jaw tightened. He knew Havens End, knew how quick it was to judge, how slow to help. The girl didn't react, but her shoulders hunched, like she'd heard it all before. Henry hammered a nail into place, the sound sharp and final. "Let 'em talk," he said quietly, not looking at her. "They don't know you." She glanced at him surprised, then gave a small nod, her lips twitching like she might smile. By evening, word of the girl had spread. Havens End was small, its gossip faster than the tide. At the general store where Henry stopped to buy nails, the clerk leaned over the counter, her voice low. "Saw you with that kid on the pier," she said, eyebrows raised. "You know her story?" "Nope," Henry said, counting out change. "Don't need to." The clerk frowned, like he'd missed the point. "Folks are saying she's trouble. No parents, no home. You sure you want to get mixed up in that?" Henry met her gaze, his blue eyes steady. "I'm sure," he said, and walked out, the bell above the door jangling behind him. Outside the air was cool, the streetlights flickering on. He felt the town's eyes on him, some warm, some cold. Sally from the diner waved from across the street, her smile genuine. But others, men in flannel, women with crossed arms, watched him like he was stirring a pot best left alone. The next morning, Henry found the girl at the pier again, this time with a broken bicycle propped against a post. Its chain dangled, rusted and useless, and she was poking at it with a stick, her face scrunched in frustration. "Need a hand?" Henry asked, setting his toolbox down. She looked up, startled, then nodded. He knelt beside her, the gravel biting into his knees, and got to work. The chain was a mess, but he'd fixed worse. As he worked, she sat close, watching his hands move with a quiet intensity. "You're good at this," she said after a while. "Practice," Henry replied, wiping sweat from his brow. "You ride this a lot?" "Used to," she said, her voice soft. "Before stuff happened." He didn't push, but the word before hung in the air, heavy with things unsaid. When the chain was fixed, she climbed onto the bike, testing the pedals. Her face lit up just for a second, and Henry felt something warm in his chest, like a fire he'd forgotten how to stoke. But the town wasn't done with them. That afternoon, as Henry repaired a bench on Main Street, a man in a crisp suit approached. Tom Carver, the town's unofficial mayor, all smiles and hidden edges. "Henry," he said, clapping a hand on his shoulder, "heard you're playing hero to some kid. Careful now. Folks don't like strangers, especially ones with no roots." Henry kept sanding the bench, the wood's grain rough under his fingers. "She's just a kid," he said, not looking up. Carver's smile tightened. "Kids like that bring trouble. You're a good man, Henry, but don't let her drag you down." Henry stopped sanding, his hand still on the wood. "She's not dragging anyone," he said, voice low but sharp. "Maybe the town could try helping instead of talking." Carver's eyes narrowed, but he backed off, his polished shoes clicking on the pavement as he left. The trial came a day later, swift and brutal. Henry was at the pier again, tightening bolts on a railing when a police cruiser pulled up. Officer Daniels, a broad man with a permanent scowl, stepped out, his belt creaking under the weight of his gear. "Henry," he said, voice clipped, "got a complaint. That girl you're with, she's been seen near some break-ins. Folks want answers." Henry stood, wiping his hands on his jeans. "She's no thief," he said, his voice steady but his heart racing. Daniels crossed his arms. "Maybe not, but she's got no guardian, no address. Social services is coming tomorrow. You keep her close, you're risking trouble." Henry's jaw clenched. He thought of the girl's drawing, her patched sweater, the way she'd trusted him with that apple. "She's got me," he said finally. "That's enough for now." Daniels shook his head like Henry was a fool. "Your call," he said, climbing back into the cruiser. "But don't say I didn't warn you." That night, Henry sat in his small kitchen, the single bulb overhead casting harsh shadows. The table was scarred, its edges worn from years of solitary meals. He held a pair of sneakers. Small, barely used, left behind by a life that wasn't his anymore. He'd meant to give them to the girl tomorrow, to replace her worn-out ones. But Daniel's words echoed, heavy as the sea. What was he doing? Getting involved? He was no father, no hero, just a man who fixed things. Yet the thought of her alone, taken by strangers, made his chest ache. He set the sneakers down, his hands trembling just a fraction. The conflict escalated faster than he'd expected. By the next morning, the town was buzzing. At the diner, Sally pulled him aside, her face tight with worry. "Henry, people are talking," she said, her voice low. "They're saying you're hiding that girl, keeping her from the law. Some even think you're involved." Henry's coffee went cold in his hands. "Involved?" he repeated, the word bitter on his tongue. Sally looked away, embarrassed. "Not me, but you know how folks get. They don't understand why you'd care." He pushed his mug away, the ceramics scraping the counter. "Let him talk," he said, but the words felt hollow now. Outside, he saw Carver across the street, talking to a group of shopkeepers, their heads shaking, their eyes darting his way. The air felt thicker, like a storm was brewing, and Henry was right in its path. He found the girl at the pier, as always, her bicycle propped nearby. She was sketching this time, a new drawing, her pencil moving with quiet focus. "Hey," he said, sitting beside her. "You okay?" She nodded, but her eyes were red, like she'd been crying. "People keep staring," she said, her voice small. "They think I'm bad." Henry's heart twisted. "You're not bad," he said, his voice firm. "You're just you." She looked at Semi, searching his face, and for the first time she smiled. A small, fragile thing, but real. He wanted to promise her safety, promise her a home, but the words stuck in his throat. The town was closing in, and he wasn't sure he could hold it back. The pier was quiet that evening, the kind of quiet that pressed against your chest like a warning. The sun had dipped below the horizon, leaving Haven's End bathed in a cool lavender twilight. Henry sat on the edge, his boots dangling over the water, the familiar weight of his toolbox beside him. The girl wasn't there. He'd come expecting to see her. Her green sweater, her messy brown hair, that crumpled drawing clutched like a lifeline. But the pier was empty. The only sound, the soft slap of waves against the pilings and the distant cry of a gull. His stomach twisted, a knot of worry he couldn't shake. She'd been here every day for a week, a constant in his routine as steady as the tide. Now, her absence felt like a hole, jagged and raw. He replayed their last conversation, her small smile, the way she'd said, "People think I'm bad." He'd told her she wasn't, but had he done enough? The sneakers he'd brought for her sat in his toolbox, small and untouched, their laces still crisp from years in storage. He'd planned to give them to her today, to see her face light up like it had when he fixed her bike. But the pier stretched out, silent, mocking him with its emptiness. He stood, his knees creaking, and scanned the horizon, as if she might appear from the shadows. Nothing, just the faint glint of moonlight on the water and the salty tang of the air. Something was wrong. He could feel it, like the ache in his bones before a storm. Henry walked back to town, his toolbox heavier than usual, the metal handle biting into his palm. The streets of Havens End were alive with the evening hum. Shopkeepers locking up, kids racing home, the diner's neon sign buzzing faintly. But the air felt charged, like the town was holding its breath. He stopped at the general store, hoping the clerk might have seen the girl. "Kid with a green sweater?" the clerk said, chewing gum, her eyes narrow. "Not today. Heard she's trouble, though. You still messing with her?" Henry's jaw tightened. "She's not trouble," he said, voice low but sharp. The clerk shrugged, like it wasn't her problem, and turned back to her register. Henry left, the bell above the door jangling like an accusation. At the diner, Sally was wiping down tables, her apron streaked with grease. "Henry," she said, her voice soft but urgent. "You hear what folks are saying?" He slid into a booth, the vinyl cold against his back. "Tell me," he said, though he already knew it wouldn't be good. Sally leaned in, her hands twisting the rag. "They're saying the girl stole from the bakery. Bread, a couple pastries. Mrs. Larson saw her near the back door last night, and now everyone's pointing fingers." Henry's coffee mug stopped halfway to his mouth. "She didn't steal," he said, his voice steady but his heart racing. Sally bit her lip. "I believe you, but folks are riled up, and they're mad at you for sticking by her. Tom Carver's been stirring the pot, saying you're enabling a thief." Henry set the mug down, the ceramic clinking hard against the table. "Carver's got no proof," he said, but the words felt thin, like paper in the wind. The condemnation came fast, like a wave crashing over the shore. By morning, Havens End was a cauldron of whispers and glares. Henry walked to the pier, his boots heavy on the pavement, and felt the town's eyes on him. A group of fishermen outside the bait shop stopped talking as he passed, their faces hard. "Her fixer's gone soft," one muttered, loud enough to carry. "Harbouring a crook." Henry kept walking, his hands clenched in his pockets, but the words stung. At the bakery, Mrs. Larson stood in the doorway, her arms crossed. "You ought to be ashamed," she called after him. "That girl's no good and you're making it worse." Henry didn't turn, didn't answer, but his chest burned. He'd fixed her oven last month, no charge, and now she was spitting venom like he was the enemy. The pier was still empty. The girl's absence, a scream in the silence. Henry knelt by the railing, pretending to check the bolts, but his hands shook as he worked. The town's accusations echoed in his head. Thief, trouble, runaway. He didn't believe them, but doubt crept in, cold and insidious. What if he was wrong about her? What if his kindness had been misplaced? A fool's errand in a world that didn't care. He thought of his wife, her voice soft in his memory. "You fix what's broken, Henry, because someone has to." But what if some things were too broken to fix? What if he'd failed the girl, just like he'd failed to save his wife, his dreams, his life? The emotional peak hit that afternoon, under a grey sky heavy with the promise of rain. Henry was at the diner, nursing a coffee he didn't want, when Tom Carver walked in, flanked by two shopkeepers. Their faces were set like men on a mission. "Henry," Carver said, his voice smooth but sharp, "we need to talk." Henry looked up, his blue eyes tired but unyielding. "Talk then," he said, leaning back in the booth. Carver slid into the seat across from him, his suit crisp against the cracked vinyl. "The girl's gone, and good riddance," he said, "but you're causing problems. Folks don't trust you anymore. You're defending a thief, making us look weak." Henry's hands tightened around his mug, the ceramic warm against his palms. "She's no thief," he said, his voice low, almost a growl. Carver leaned forward, his smile cold. "No proof she isn't. Social services is coming tomorrow. They'll take her, and you'd better stay out of it, or you'll lose more than your reputation." Henry's heart pounded, his breath catching. Lose more? He'd already lost everything. His wife, his career, his hope. What was left to take? But the thought of the girl, alone, taken by strangers, made his blood boil. "Get out," Henry said, his voice quiet but deadly. Carver blinked, surprised, then stood, his chair scraping the floor. "You're digging your own grave, Fixer," he said, and walked out, the shopkeepers trailing like shadows. The diner went silent, every eye on Henry. Sally hovered nearby, her rag twisting in her hands. But she didn't speak. Henry stared at the table, his vision blurring. He felt the weight of the town's judgment, the sting of betrayal. Not just from Carver, but from the people he'd helped for years. He'd fixed their homes, their lives, and now they turned on him, ready to believe the worst. His hands shook, and for the first time in years, he felt tears prick his eyes. "Damn it," he whispered, his voice breaking, his fists clenched so tight his knuckles whitened. He was at the edge, teetering, and the girl's absence was the push that could send him over. That night, Henry sat in his small house, the walls bare except for a single photo on the mantel. Him and his wife, young and laughing, the shipyard behind them. The sneakers for the girl sat on the table, a silent rebuke. He hadn't found her, hadn't even seen a trace. Social services would come tomorrow, and if she was still missing, what then? He felt like he'd failed her, like he'd failed everyone. The town's words clawed at him. Trouble, thief, fool. He stood, pacing the creaky floorboards, his shadow long in the dim light. His toolbox sat in the corner, its rusted edges catching the glow of the single bulb overhead. He stopped, his hand brushing the photo on the mantel. His wife's smile was frozen in time, her eyes full of faith in him. "You fix what's broken," she'd said, and he'd believed her. But now, with the girl gone and the town against him, he wasn't sure he could fix anything. He sank into a chair, his hands covering his face. The house was too quiet, the kind of quiet that amplified every doubt. He thought of the girl's drawing, that house with the tree, the figure in the doorway. Was it a memory, a hope? He didn't know, and the not knowing was a knife in his gut. But then he remembered her smile, small and fragile, when he'd fixed her bike. That smile had been real, hadn't it? It had to mean something. He stood, his movements slow but deliberate, and picked up the sneakers. He'd keep looking for her, no matter what the town said. He'd keep fixing because that's who he was. The doubt didn't vanish, but it eased, just enough to let him breathe. Outside, the night was heavy with the scent of rain. Henry stepped onto his porch, the air cool against his face. The stars were hidden, but the moon cast a faint glow, enough to see the path to the pier. He didn't know if the girl would be there, didn't know if he'd ever see her again, but he'd go anyway, because some things were worth fighting for, even when the world told you to stop. His boots crunched on the gravel, the sneakers tucked under his arm, a small act of faith in a town that had none. The rain came at dawn, a soft drizzle that painted Haven's End in shades of grey. Henry stood on the pier, his navy jacket damp, the sneakers still tucked under his arm. The sea was restless, waves churning below, their rhythm matching the ache in his chest. He'd searched all night, down alleys, behind the diner, along the rocky shore, calling for the girl, her green sweater a ghost in his mind. Nothing. No sign of her bike, her drawing, her wary hazel eyes. The town's accusations hung over him like the clouds, heavy and unyielding. Social services would arrive soon, and if the girl was still missing, what could he do? He gripped the sneakers tighter, their laces damp from the mist, and stared at the horizon. "Damn it, kid," he muttered, his voice lost in the wind. "Where are you?" The revelation came unexpectedly, like a crack of light through the storm. As Henry turned to leave the pier, his boots slipping on the wet planks, a figure approached from the fog. Not the girl, but a woman. Mid-40s, with short black hair and a face lined with worry. She wore a grey coat, its hem mud-stained, and carried a manila envelope, clutched like it might blow away. "Henry?" she asked, her voice hesitant but clear. He stopped, his blue eyes narrowing. "Who's asking?" he said, his tone guarded. The woman stepped closer, her shoes clicking on the wood. "My name's Clara," she said. I was her aunt." Henry's heart skipped, the word "was" landing like a stone. "The girl?" he asked, his voice rough. "You know where she is?" Clara's eyes softened, but there was pain there, deep and raw. She's safe, she said, but I need to tell you something. About her. About why she was here. They sat on a bench at the pier's edge, the rain pattering around them. Clara opened the envelope, pulling out a photo. A younger version of the girl, smiling beside a woman who looked like Clara. Her name's Lily, Clara said, her voice trembling. My sister's daughter. My sister, she passed last year. Car accident. Lily's been lost ever since. Henry listened, his hands still on the sneakers. The story unraveling like a thread. Lily had run away from foster care, Clara explained, chasing a memory of Haven's End, where her mother had brought her as a baby. That drawing, the house, the tree, the figure in the doorway, was her mother's old sketch, a keepsake Lily carried everywhere. She came here looking for something, Clara said. A home, maybe, or just a place to feel safe. Henry's throat tightened. And she found you, Clara added, her eyes meeting his. You gave her that. Henry shook his head, the weight of the words too much. I didn't do anything, he said, his voice low. Just fixed her bike, gave her an apple. Clara smiled, small but real. You saw her, she said, when no one else did. She told me about you. The fixer, she called you. Said you didn't treat her like a problem. Henry looked at the photo. Lily's smile so like the one he'd seen on the pier. Where is she now? He asked, almost afraid of the answer. With me, Clara said. I found her last night at the old lighthouse. She was scared, but she's okay. I'm taking her home. To my home. She'll have a place now. Henry exhaled, a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. The sneakers in his hands felt lighter, like they'd served their purpose just by being there. Clara reached into her coat and pulled out a folded piece of paper. She left this for you, she said, handing it to him. Henry unfolded it carefully, the paper soft from wear. It was Lily's drawing. The house, the tree, the figure in the doorway. But now, there was a new sketch beside it. A man with silver hair, a toolbox at his side, standing on a pier. Underneath, in careful pencil, she'd written, Thank you, Fixer. Henry's vision blurred, his fingers tracing the words. He hadn't failed her. Not entirely. The rain fell hard now, but he didn't care. This was his catharsis. A quiet moment of proof that his kindness hadn't been for nothing. The town didn't see it that way, not at first. As Henry walked back to Main Street, the sneakers now in his toolbox, the whispers followed. Fixer's lost it, a fisherman muttered outside the bait shop. Chasing after a thief, Mrs. Larson huffed, sweeping her bakery's stoop. Tom Carver stood by the general store, his suit pristine despite the rain, talking to a small crowd. See, he's a liability, Carver said, loud enough for Henry to hear. Defending a runaway, stirring up trouble. Henry kept walking, his head high, but the words cut deep. He'd spent years fixing this town, and now they turned on him, blind to the truth. But then something shifted. Sally was the first to break ranks. She stood outside the diner, her apron soaked, and called out, Henry, wait! He turned, surprised, as she jogged over, her face fierce. I heard about the girl, she said. Clara came by, told me everything. Lily wasn't stealing, she was hungry. Mrs. Larson's wrong. Henry blinked, the rain dripping from his hair. Doesn't matter, he said. They've made up their minds. Sally shook her head, her voice rising. No, they haven't. Not all of us. You're not alone in this. She turned to the crowd by the store, her hands on her hips. You all know Henry, she shouted. He's fixed your homes, your lives for nothing. And you're going to believe Carver over him? The crowd shifted, uncomfortable, some looking away. Carver's smile faltered, just for a second. The transformation started small, like a ripple on the water. That afternoon, a fisherman approached Henry at the diner, his flannel shirt damp. Sorry, he mumbled, scratching his neck. Didn't know the kid's story. You did right by her. By evening, the general store clerk slipped Henry a free coffee, her usual smirk gone. Clara explained, she said quietly. You're okay, Fixer. Even Mrs. Larson, red-faced, muttered an apology the next day, leaving a loaf of bread at Henry's door. Carver, sensing the tide turning, backed off, his influence fading like fog in the sun. The town didn't change overnight, but the shift was real. People started talking, to each other, to Henry, about Lily, about kindness, about seeing the unseen. A new tradition took root, a weekly Fixers' Day at the pier, where folks brought broken things to mend together, sharing stories and coffee. It wasn't perfect, but it was a start. The legacy of Henry's kindness grew quietly, like the girl's smile in his memory. Clara sent him letters from Lily. Short notes about her new school, her new bike, her new drawings. Each one ended with, "Thanks, fixer," and Henry kept them in a tin box beside his wife's photo. He didn't fix everything. His own heart still carried scars, but he found a new purpose. He started teaching kids at the pier, showing them how to mend bikes, build shelves, patch dreams. The town's children called him Grandpa Fixer, their laughter filling the holes left by years of loss. Haven's End began to feel like home again, not just a place to survive. Henry's small acts, his stubborn heart, had changed something fundamental, proving that kindness, even when mocked, could outlast the storm. One morning, months later, Henry stood on the pier, the sun rising in a blaze of gold. The air smelled of salt and possibility, the waves whispering secrets to the shore. His toolbox sat beside him, its rusted edges softened by the light. He held Lily's drawing, now framed, its pencil lines a map of his redemption. The pier was alive with people. Kids hammering nails, adults sharing coffee, the town breathing as one. Henry's eyes, tired but bright, traced the horizon. He'd fixed something bigger than a bike or a bench. He'd fixed a piece of the world, one quiet act at a time. Keep fixing, he whispered to himself, his wife's voice echoing in his heart. And he would, because some things, kindness, hope, courage, didn't break. They bent, they weathered, but they held. Final image and call to action. Henry, a 65-year-old man with silver hair, stands on a sunlit pier at dawn, his worn navy jacket open, toolbox at his feet, holding a framed drawing of a house and a man, his blue eyes shining with quiet pride, the sea sparkling behind him. Kids and townsfolk working together in the background, hammering and laughing, realistic cinematic style, atmosphere warm and hopeful. Hey folks, did Henry's story hit you in the heart? Drop a comment. What moved you most? Hit that like, subscribe, and ring the bell. These stories of quiet heroism are too good to miss.